everything happens very quickly. As in, when the whale hunt is on, everyone is mega focused on doing the right thing in order to get the whale. It's very intense, and boats will get crushed or like capsize, and people will fall into the water, and it's chaotic. They still manage to work together, obviously, because they're very experienced, but it's a lot of screaming. It's very intense, as in it's very raw and intense. Yeah.
That's Marco Grossman, a German traveler lucky enough to witness a whale hunt in Lamalera, a tiny village on a remote island in eastern Indonesia. CNA senior correspondent Saifulbahri Ismail also spent part of the whaling season in Lamalera, living alongside the fishermen, the harpooners, and their families who wait for them to come back from the hunts. No harpoon guns are used during the hunts, and there's no sonar. A man called the Lamafar simply dives off a wooden boat with a hand-forged harpoon and uses his own weight to harpoon the mammal. It's been done this way for hundreds of years, not for profit, but for survival. I'm Arnold Gay. This is the CNA Correspondent podcast, and Saiful is with me now. Saiful, so you cover the most interesting and fascinating stories. 10 days during the whaling season in Lamalera, living with the fishermen, with the harpooners. However, you didn't get to see an actual hunt yourself. So how is that possible, Saiful?
It's just my bad luck in my case. Even before I went to Lamalera, Arnold, I had already prepared myself for the possibility that I might not see a sperm whale at sea. And I think that's important for anyone visiting Lamalera. You shouldn't go there with the expectation that you're definitely going to see a whale, because you could come away very disappointed. And that disappointment is understandable. Because getting to Lamalera is not easy. You have to take multiple flights, and then there's this long drive across Lembata Island's rugged mountainous interior. So by the time you finally arrive, there's naturally this huge sense of anticipation, right? But that's the thing about Lamalera. This isn't a zoo. These aren't animals waiting for you to turn up. And I think if you go to Lamalera purely expecting a spectacle, you risk missing what makes the place so fascinating. Now, in some ways, not seeing a whale actually helped me to appreciate that there's so much more to Lamalera than the hunt itself. And that's something I tried to bring out in the CNA Correspondent episode.
Right.
In the first segment, I look at why the tradition matters, the rituals, the beliefs, and the preparations that take place. In the second segment, I focus on the hunt itself and the people who make it possible, including the Lamafar or chief harpooner, and the risk they take. And in the final segment, I look ahead. Can the centuries-old tradition survive the pressures of the modern world? So yes, I spent 10 days there and didn't see a sperm whale hunt. But in the end, I don't think that prevented me from telling the story of Lamalera. In some ways, it helped me understand what the real story was.
Saiful, I want to pick up on that because you really actually saw everything else apart from the actual hunt, the preparation. You were talking about that. The boats, which are launched, from the beach, the crews getting ready, the gear, they use as well. So put it all together, for us. What does a hunt look like, from start to finish, based on what you saw there personally and what people told you as well?
Arnold, you probably need a 1 hour podcast for me to take you through the whole hunt.
Give us the quick version.
Sure. But one thing that I can share, which really struck me, and you mentioned this about the boats, and that I was able to experience firsthand, was something that happens before and after the hunt, and that's getting the pledang or the traditional whaling boat into and out of the sea. These are very heavy wooden boats, and you can't simply push them across Lamalera's coarse volcanic beach. So the fishermen place round locks underneath the keel and roll the boat over them, almost like a traditional conveyor belt. While it looks ancient and primitive at first glance, it's actually quite efficient, using the rules of physics that civilizations have used for thousands of years to move massive objects. Now, what surprised me was that bringing the playdown back is even harder. Imagine spending an entire day at sea. You're already exhausted, and now you have to push this heavy, waterlocked wooden boat back up a steep beach. But this is where you really see the communal spirit of Lamalera. When a playground returns, people on the beach don't just stand around and watch. They gather around the boat and help push it back up the shore. It becomes this huge collective effort, people heaving and pushing together in rhythm. And I actually got to experience that myself. I joined them in pushing one of the playground back up the beach. And I think that experience helped me understand something about the whale hunt itself. The hunt is really a communal effort from beginning to end. It takes an entire crew and, in many ways, an entire village to make it happen.
So, community in the real sense of the word, Saiful. You spoke to
Definitely.
everyone, I think, in the village. In particular, one stood out for me, a Lamafa, a harpooner. His name is Benjamin Kaleka Tapuna. And he told you this.
The thing I fear most is getting tangled in the rope. A whale's tail can strike the crew. Some people have been killed, others seriously injured. Just the other day, an older man got his foot caught in the rope and lost it. There are many dangers. When you're on the peladang, you have to stay completely focused.
So, Saiful, he's 25 years old. He's lost people that he knows, yet he chose this way of life. How come?
Sometimes becoming a Lama Fa isn't entirely a matter of choice. Now, Benjamin comes from a family of Lama Fa. He's the fifth generation, in fact, following in the footsteps of his father, his late grandfather, and so on. Now, what really struck me when I interviewed Benjamin was the contrast between the person I saw and what I heard in his voice. Now, here's this strong, well built, confident young man, but when he started talking about the dangers at sea, I could sense that the fear was so real. He's seen people around him get seriously injured. Now, one of the biggest dangers is the rope attached to the harpoon. Now, when a sperm whale is struck and suddenly dives, that rope can run out incredibly fast. Now, if someone's hand or leg becomes caught in it, the consequences can be devastating. But that's only one of the dangers. Now, sperm whales are enormous, powerful animals. A strike from the tail or a collision with a playdown can damage or even capsize the boat, throwing crew members into the water. Now, that brings another set of risks. After a whale has been struck, sharks may also be attracted to the blood. Aggressive feeding sharks are also dangerous for the crew who may have fallen off the boat. So when Benjamin says everyone aboard the playdown has to remain completely focused, you realize he's not exaggerating. And I think that's what stayed with me after speaking to him. We tend to associate the Lama Fa with courage because of that extraordinary image of him leaping from the bow with the harpoon. No, but speaking to Benjamin reminded me that courage doesn't mean being fearless. It's understanding exactly what you're risking and going out to sea anyway.
Saiful, before any boat even touches the water, there's a whole calendar of rituals. Some names I can't pronounce, but a lot of them, as I understand it, happen even before the season begins, well before the season begins. So my question now is, when everyone takes part, is this tradition? Is this superstition? Or is this sort of a plea, a prayer for good luck?
I would say it's mostly tradition, but tradition in Lamalera isn't something separate from everyday life. Now, these customs remain incredibly strong because they're tied to the community survival, food security, and identity. Now, the rituals provide a sense of order and spiritual protection before the fishermen face the dangers and uncertainties at sea. Now, one of the most important rituals is Tobu Namafate, which essentially means gathering together on the beach. Now, before the hunting season begins, village leaders, clan elders, boat builders, the lamafas, and fishermen come together to discuss issues within the community and resolve disagreements. Now, what's fascinating is that these aren't necessarily disagreements about ancient customs. Some are very modern debates. Now, one of the biggest, for example, is whether hunters should use outboard motors on their boats
Okay.
or their playdowns. Now, for traditionalists, there's a belief that the whale is a gift from the ancestors and that the hunt should be carried out in the most traditional way. with wooden boats, oars, and sails, and introducing an engine changes that relationship with the sea and, in their view, risk undermining the tradition itself. But younger fishermen can look at it very differently. For them, an engine or a motor is also about safety and practicality. Now, if the wind disappears and you're kilometers from shore, the motor or engine could be what gets you home safely to your family. So, what I found really interesting is that these rituals aren't simply about superstition or asking for good luck. They're also a space where Lamalera negotiates change. How much can you modernize a tradition before it stops being the tradition you were trying to preserve? And then there's another very interesting layer to all of this. It's the Catholic Church.
Okay, let's talk about that because I found that facet fascinating. Most of the village is Catholic, despite being in Indonesia, which is a predominantly Muslim country.
That's right.
But when Catholicism arrived, sometimes it happens, but the whaling traditions in Lamalera did not disappear. Instead, they, sort of became intertwined. How is it that both, you know, came to become, to exist so closely?
Now, there's actually something quite symbolic about how the Catholic faith arrived in Lamalera. A bit of history. When the faith reached Lembata Island in 1886, Lamalera became one of its gateways onto the island. Now, one of the early missionaries was a German priest, Father Bernhard Bode, who arrived in Lamalera aboard a traditional playdown. Now, that's so symbolic, right? The very same type of wooden boat the community uses for whale hunting. Now, the Catholic faith arrived in a community where the whaling tradition had already existed for centuries. Hunting wasn't simply a cultural practice, it was fundamental to survival. Lamalera sits on dry, rocky land where agriculture is extremely difficult. So, historically, the community depended heavily on what it could get from the sea. Now, rather than completely displacing those older traditions, the Catholic faith gradually became intertwined with them. Now, the clearest example is Misa Leva, or the Mass held every year on 1st of May to mark the opening of the whaling season. The community gathers for Mass, and the priest blesses the fishermen, the playdang, and harpoons before they head out to sea. Now, I actually sat down with a local priest and asked this slightly provocative question. I asked him, which is stronger in Lamalera, religion or tradition? Understandably, he didn't choose one over the other, but he told me a wonderful story. He said, you could be in the middle of Mass and suddenly hear people outside the church shouting that a sperm whale had been spotted. And when that happens, the fishermen would leave the church, rush down to the beach, get into their boats, head out to sea, and hunt the whale. Now, that tells you almost everything you need to know about Lamalera. It's not necessarily that tradition is stronger than religion or that survival takes precedence over faith. It's that for the people here, faith, tradition, and survival aren't easily separated in the first place.
There's a very personal dimension to all of this, a family angle, if you like, which a former Lamafa, I think his name is Bernardus Torong Tapuna, told you about. What exactly did he say?
Bernardus is actually Benjamin's father. And Benjamin, of course, is the young Lamafa we heard from earlier. Now, when I spoke to Bernardus, I asked him a fairly straightforward question. As a former Lamafa who has experienced the dangers of the hunt himself, what advice does he give his son? And his answer really surprised me. He didn't tell Benjamin how to handle the harpoon, how to avoid getting tangled in the ropes, or what to do when a whale turns on the boat. Instead, he talked about something that happens before Benjamin even steps onto the playdang. Make sure there's peace within the family.
Before we go out to sea, fathers and mothers always remind the family that everyone must first be united. Husband and wife, brothers and sisters alike. There must be no fighting, no quarreling, and no grudges.
That's because in Lamalera, there's a very strong belief that you shouldn't carry anger, grudges, or unresolved disputes with you when you go out to sea. If there are unresolved conflicts, some believe that spiritual balance is disturbed and that this can affect what happens at sea. Now, whether you look at that spiritually or practically, I think there's something very interesting going on. Now, these men are heading out to sea in a wooden boat to hunt an enormous and powerful animal. They could be out there for hours, in fact, the whole day. If something goes wrong, they have to depend completely on one another. So trust isn't an abstract idea. It's a matter of survival. And I think that's what Bernardo's advice to Benjamin really revealed to me. Before you can trust the man beside you with your life at sea, you first have to make sure there's peace between you on land. For me, that was one of the most fascinating things about Lamalera. The rituals may be spiritual, but they also serve a very practical purpose. They reinforce trust, discipline, and unity before the crew faces the dangers of the open sea.
So Saiful, with this degree of preparation, not just physical, mental, psychological, most people would think the payoff must be really high. But having looked at some of the material you sent through, it isn't anymore. How have the catch numbers changed over the years, Saiful?
The numbers have certainly come down. The village head told me that around 7 years ago, there was one extraordinary day when fishermen landed 7 sperm whales. Compare that with last year when they caught just 3, and as of July this year, they caught only 1. So why are they catching fewer whales? Well, that's the traditional explanation, and then there's the scientific one. As I mentioned earlier, the people of Lamalera regard whales as gifts from God and their ancestors. So when the whales don't appear, some in the community don't see it simply as bad luck. They look inward. There's a belief that something within the community may be out of balance, that there could be unresolved disputes, wrongdoing, or breakdown in harmony. Then there's the scientific explanation. Now, sperm whales are migratory animals. And whether they pass close enough to Lamalera for these traditional boats to reach them depends on a whole range of environmental factors. Researchers are looking at whether changes in ocean conditions, including currents and water temperatures, which could be the effect of climate change, could be affecting where the whales travel and how close they come to shore. And that's an important distinction. Fewer whales being caught doesn't mean there are fewer sperm whales in the ocean. It could also mean fewer whales are passing within the reach of Lamalera's hunters. Remember, these fishermen aren't operating large commercial whaling vessels that can travel huge distances looking for whales. They're going out in very traditional wooden boats or pledang.
Right.
Now, if the whales shift their route farther offshore, even by a relatively modest distance, that can make an enormous difference to whether the fishermen can reach them. So you have these two ways of understanding the same problem. One asks what's changed within the community, and other asks what's changed in the ocean.
So Saiful, this sets me up very nicely for my next question. Here's the thing, right? Whatever the size of the catch, maybe it's as you say, coming down very sharply, or if it's a good day, nothing that's ever caught or landed is ever sold, right? It's distributed, through the community of 1,600 people you were saying. There are even shares, reserved for, those who cannot fend for themselves, the widows, the orphans, and the sick. And even if there's leftovers, then that's not sold either, right? It's bartered with neighboring villages in exchange for produce. So if we put, that and together with the fact that the catch has been falling, does the question of sustainability come into play at all? I mean, do the villagers ever wonder if they're taking too much?
Yeah, sustainability is definitely one issue which I tried to address in this CNA Correspondent episode. But first of all, perhaps we have to understand that there's clearly no evidence that Lamalera's subsistence sperm whale hunt is ecologically unsustainable. The numbers being caught are are actually relatively small compared with the wider migratory population of sperm whales. But the marine scientists and conservationists I spoke to raised a different question. Now, she said, even there's no evidence of over-harvesting today, shouldn't there still be an agreed limit on how many whales can be taken each year? Now, at the moment, there isn't a formal annual quota specifically governing a Lamalera sperm whale catch in the way that some other subsistence whaling communities around the world operate under regulated catch limits, for example, in Greenland or in Alaska. And conservationists argue that this discussion is becoming more important because the hunt itself is changing. Some crews now use, I mentioned earlier, outboard motors to assist their traditional boats. That raises the question of whether modern technology could eventually increase hunting capacity. Now, from the Lamalera people's perspective, though you hear a very different argument, they would say the hunt already has its own natural limits. Think about what they're doing. They're going after an enormous sperm whale from a wooden boat with a hand-thrown harpoon. So the sheer difficulty of the hunting method naturally restricts how many whales they can catch. And then there's another layer. It's the customary law. Now, the community forbids taking pregnant females, mothers with calves, and very young whales. So you essentially have two different approaches to sustainability because ultimately, both sides have something they want to preserve. Conservationists want to preserve the whales. The people of Lamalera want to preserve a way of life. The challenge is finding a way for those two goals to coexist.
So, Saiful, what's happening as well is that local officials are pushing quite hard for UNESCO recognition. This, however, requires, community consent. Do you have a sense of whether the villages are behind this, or is this strictly a push from the government? Maybe a more important way is to put this. Is there even going to be a practice left, in 20 years' time? I mean, you spoke to Marianus, who chose university over fishing, and then Finche Bataona, who's, documenting the whale hunts because she's not entirely convinced that this tradition is going to last. So which is it?
There's a genuine concern in Lamalera about that. Like many remote communities, young people are leaving the village in search of education and better economic opportunities elsewhere. Marianus is a really interesting example. Now, when he was a boy, he told me he actually dreamed of joining a Pledang crew and perhaps one day becoming a Lama Fa. But his parents wouldn't allow him to go to sea. Now, they understood how dangerous the hunt could be, and Marianus is their only child. So for them, protecting their son was more important than ensuring he continued the family's connection with the hunt. And I think his story illustrates one of the great paradoxes facing Lamalera. Parents naturally want a better and safer life for their children, but if every generation succeeds in giving their children that alternative, who will be left to continue the tradition? There's an economic dimension to this as well. Historically, Lamalera's economy revolved heavily around subsistence and barter, but young people today also need cash for education and all the other expenses that come with modern life, to buy their handphones and so on. Now, a dangerous, physically demanding life at sea may simply not be as attractive when education can open the door to other opportunities. That's why I found my conversation with Finche Bataona quite moving. She's a former journalist who has written books documenting the roles of the Lama Fa and the Lama Uri or helmsman. And she told me quite frankly and openly that if young people no longer feel called to continue the tradition, then perhaps one way of preventing it from disappearing completely is to document it through books. Now, the village head also shares the same concern. His view is that one answer is to create better economic opportunities within Lamalera itself. If young people can get an education, earn a decent living, and build a future without having to leave the village permanently, then perhaps they can remain connected to their culture, even if they don't all become whale hunters. And that brings us back to UNESCO. Government recognition can certainly help preserve and promote the tradition, but a heritage designation by itself can't keep a culture alive. Ultimately, a living tradition survives because people still choose to practice it, teach it, and pass it on. So perhaps the real question isn't simply whether UNESCO will recognize Lamalera's whaling tradition. It's whether the next generation of Lamalerans will choose to inherit it.
Saiful, until your next interesting assignment, thank you very much.
Thank you, Arnold, for having me.
I'm Arnold Gay. See you on the next CNA Correspondent podcast. It was brought to you by Tiffany Ang, Ned Fertilvero, Zikri Ayman, and Craig Dale.